The sound echoed through the abandoned copper mine like a wounded animal's cry, weak, desperate, barely human. Sarah Mitchell froze at the entrance, her lantern casting dancing shadows on the rocky walls. She had come here searching for shelter from the sudden Wyoming storm, never expecting to find something that would change everything she thought she knew about survival, mercy, and the price of doing what's right. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1876, and the Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under a sky that promised nothing but hardship. Sarah Mitchell had learned this truth the hard way over the past 8 months, ever since she'd left her comfortable life in Philadelphia to join her brother's mining operation near the Wind River Range. What had seemed like an adventure in her brother's letters had quickly revealed itself as a daily battle against elements that cared nothing for Eastern sensibilities or a woman's determination to prove herself in a man's world. The Copper Ridge Mine had been abandoned for nearly 2 years when Sarah first discovered it during one of her geological surveys. Her brother Thomas had tasked her with mapping potential new sites, partly because of her education in natural sciences, but mostly because it kept her busy and away from the rougher aspects of their operation. The mine shaft descended 40 feet into granite and limestone, its walls still bearing the tool marks of miners who had given up when the copper veins proved too sparse to justify the backbreaking labor. On this particular October morning, Sarah had set out before dawn to collect mineral samples from the northern ridge. The weather had been deceptively calm when she left the main camp, with only a few wispy clouds threading through the mountain peaks. But Wyoming weather was notorious for its sudden shifts, and by mid-morning those innocent clouds had gathered into a threatening mass of grey-black storm front that sent most sensible creatures scrambling for shelter. The first drops of rain were already turning to sleet when Sarah spotted the familiar dark opening of the Copper Ridge Mine. She had her geological tools, her sample bags, and enough supplies for a day's work, but nothing that would protect her from what was clearly going to be a serious storm. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind was picking up with that particular Wyoming ferocity that could turn a simple rainstorm into a life-threatening ordeal. She had been inside the mine for perhaps 20 minutes, setting up her temporaries, camped near the entrance where enough daylight filtered in to work by when she heard it. At first, she thought it might be the wind creating strange acoustics in the shaft, or perhaps some small animal that had also sought shelter. But as she listened more carefully, holding her breath and straining her ears above the growing storm, outside she realized with a chill that went deeper than the mountain air that what she was hearing was distinctly human. The sound was coming from deeper in the mine, well beyond where the natural light reached. Sarah had explored perhaps half the accessible tunnels over the months, always staying within safe distance of the entrance and always carrying multiple light sources. She knew the main shaft extended much deeper, with several side tunnels that the original miners had carved following promising veins that ultimately led nowhere. Grabbing her most reliable lantern and checking that she had matches and candles as backup, Sarah began making her way deeper into the mine. The sounds grew, clearer as she descended, definitely human, definitely weak, and carrying a quality that made her stomach tighten with recognition. She had heard similar sounds during the cholera outbreak that had swept through Philadelphia 3 years earlier, the kind of labored breathing and occasional moaning that spoke of serious illness or injury. The main shaft angled downward at a manageable slope for the first 30 feet, but then it curved and split into 3 narrower passages. Sarah paused, listening carefully to determine which direction the sounds were coming from. The acoustics in the mine were tricky, with sounds bouncing off rock walls and seeming to come from multiple directions at once. but gradually she became certain that whatever she was hearing was coming from the leftmost passage, a tunnel that she had only briefly explored before deciding it was too unstable for regular use. As she moved deeper into this passage, her lantern light revealed evidence of a recent rockfall. Loose stones and dirt covered the tunnel floor, and she could see where part of the ceiling had given way, probably during the spring thaw when water seepage often caused problems in abandoned mines. The passage was partially blocked, but not completely impassable for someone willing to crawl through a narrow gap between fallen rocks and the tunnel wall. The sounds were definitely coming from beyond this rockfall. Sarah realized with growing concern that whoever was in there was trapped, unable to get out through the blocked passage. The gap that she could squeeze through was barely wide enough for her slight frame, and she doubted that most people could manage it, especially if they were injured or weakened. She called out first in English, then in the few words of Spanish she had picked up from the Mexican workers at her brother's mine. There was a response, faint but unmistakably an attempt at communication. The voice was young, she realized, possibly a child's voice, though it was difficult to tell through the weakness and the echoing stone walls. Getting through the gap required leaving most of her equipment behind, taking only her lantern and a small bag with medical supplies that she always carried when working alone in remote areas. The passage beyond the rockfall opened into a wider chamber, and it was here that her lantern light finally revealed what she had been hearing. A child, probably no more than 10 or 11 years old, was lying against the far wall of the chamber. Even in the flickering lantern light, Sarah could see that the child was in serious condition. The boy, she could see now that it was a boy, was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. His clothing was torn and dirty, and there were visible injuries on his arms and legs. Most striking, though, were the distinctive features and clothing that immediately identified him as Native American, almost certainly from one of the local tribes. Sarah's mind raced as she knelt beside the boy, trying to assess his condition, while simultaneously processing the implications of what she had found. Relations between white settlers and the local tribes had been tense throughout the territory, with occasional violence and a general atmosphere of mutual suspicion. Finding a Native American child alone in an abandoned mine, clearly injured and possibly dying, raised dozens of questions that she didn't have answers for. The boy's injuries appeared to be a combination of cuts, bruises, and what looked like the effects of exposure and dehydration. There was a particularly nasty gash on his left leg that had bled considerably, though it seemed to have clotted. His lips were cracked and dry, and his skin had the greyish pallor that Sarah recognized as a sign of serious dehydration. She tried, speaking to him in English, but got no response beyond a flutter of eyelids. The few Spanish words she knew were equally useless. She realized that he probably spoke only his native language, and she had no way to communicate with him directly. But communication wasn't the immediate priority. Keeping him alive was. Sarah had basic medical training, the kind that anyone living in remote areas learned out of necessity. She had water in her canteen and some basic medical supplies in her kit. The first priority was getting some water into him, which proved challenging, given his semi-conscious state. She managed to get a few drops at a time past his lips, supporting his head and being careful not to let him choke. The storm outside was intensifying, and Sarah realized that even if she could somehow get the boy through the narrow gap and out of the mine, traveling in the current weather would be extremely dangerous for someone in his condition. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to make him as comfortable as possible in the chamber and wait for the storm to pass before attempting to move him. But as she worked to clean and bandage his wounds by lantern light, Sarah began to understand that this boy's presence in the mine wasn't accidental. His injuries weren't consistent with a simple fall or accident. The cuts on his arms looked deliberate, defensive wounds that suggested he had been in some kind of fight or struggle. His clothing, while torn and dirty, was well made and decorated with beadwork that suggested he came from a family of some status within his tribe. The more she examined the situation, the more convinced she became that this boy hadn't simply wandered into the mine and gotten trapped by the rockfall. Someone had put him here, possibly thinking he was already dead, or possibly intending for him to die in the abandoned tunnels where his body might never be found. As the hours passed, and the storm continued to rage outside, Sarah worked to stabilize the boy's condition. She managed to get more water into him, and even got him to take a few small bites of the dried meat she carried in her supplies. His breathing became less labored, and his color improved slightly, though he remained mostly unconscious. But even as she focused on the immediate medical needs, Sarah's mind was working through the larger implications of her discovery. If this boy had been attacked and left for dead, there would be people looking for him. His family, his tribe, would eventually come searching. And when they did, they would follow his trail to this mine, where they would find him in the care of a white woman. In the current political climate of the Wyoming Territory, with tensions running high between settlers and tribes, this situation could easily be misinterpreted in dangerous ways. Sarah knew enough about recent conflicts to understand that trust between whites and Native Americans was virtually non-existent. A white person found with an injured Native American child could be seen as evidence of wrongdoing, regardless of the actual circumstances. But abandoning the boy wasn't an option she could even consider. Whatever complications might arise from helping him, the alternative, leaving a child to die alone in a dark mine shaft, was unthinkable. Sarah had always believed that some moral choices transcended practical considerations, and this was clearly one of them. As night fell and the storm began to subside, Sarah made her decision. She would get the boy out of the mine and back to her cabin, where she could provide proper medical care and figure out how to safely return him to his people. It wouldn't be easy. Getting him through the narrow gap would require careful maneuvering, and the journey back to her cabin would be challenging even under good conditions. But first, she needed to prepare him for the move. She used strips torn from her own clothing to create a makeshift stretcher from some of the mining equipment left behind in the chamber. She bundled him carefully in her spare jacket and secured the bandages on his wounds as best she could with limited supplies. The process of getting him through the gap in the rockfall was nerve-wracking and slow. Sarah had to push her improvised stretcher ahead of her, then crawl through herself, then pull it the rest of the way, all while trying to avoid jarring his injuries or causing the unstable rocks to shift further. It took nearly an hour to cover the 20 feet of blocked passage. Once they reached the main shaft, the journey became easier, but no less concerning. The boy remained unconscious, and Sarah was acutely aware that his condition, while stabilized, was still serious. The longer he remained unconscious, the more worried she became about internal injuries that she couldn't detect or treat with her limited resources. The storm had passed by the time she emerged from the mine, but the temperature had dropped significantly, and the ground was treacherous with a mixture of mud and early snow. Sarah's cabin was nearly 3 miles away, a distance that would normally take her less than an hour to cover on foot. With an unconscious child on a makeshift stretcher, traveling over rough terrain in near darkness, the journey took most of the night. By the time she reached her cabin, Sarah was exhausted, cold, and increasingly worried about her patient. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But she had succeeded in getting him to safety, and that felt like a victory worth the effort. Her cabin was small but well built, with a good fireplace and basic amenities that would allow her to provide much better care than had been possible in the mine. She got a fire going immediately and prepared a comfortable bed near the fireplace where the boy would stay warm. She heated water for cleaning his wounds more thoroughly and prepared some simple broth that she could try to get him to take when he regained consciousness. For the first time since finding him, Sarah allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic about his chances for recovery. What she didn't know, as she settled down for a few hours of much-needed rest while keeping one ear alert for any change in his condition, was that 50 Lakota warriors were already tracking their missing tribe member's trail, and that trail led directly to the abandoned mine she had just left, where her own footprints were clearly visible in the mud around the entrance. The boy she had risked everything to save was the youngest son of Chief Standing Bear, and his disappearance had already set in motion events that would test everything Sarah thought she knew about courage, justice, and the complex realities of survival on the frontier. Dawn broke over the Wind River Range with the crystalline clarity that only comes after mountain storms. But Chief Standing Bear felt no peace in the beauty of the morning light. His youngest son, Little Fox, had been missing for 4 days now, and the search parties had found nothing but cold trails and false hopes scattered across the vast Wyoming landscape. Standing Bear sat motionless on his painted stallion, surveying the terrain below from a rocky outcrop that provided a commanding view of the valley. Behind him, his most trusted warriors waited in patient silence, their horses stamping softly in the thin mountain air. These men had ridden with him through countless hunts and battles, and they could read his mood in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his head, the way his weathered hands gripped the leather reins. The chief's mind was a careful balance of hope and dread. Little Fox was only 11 winters old, but he was clever and resourceful, with an adventurous spirit that had gotten him into trouble before. Just 3 months earlier, the boy had disappeared for an entire day, only to be found miles from camp, trying to capture a golden eagle chick from its nest, high on a cliff face. Standing Bear had been angry then, but also secretly proud of his son's courage and determination. This time felt different. Little Fox had vanished during the night, sometime between the evening meal and sunrise, with no indication of where he might have gone or why. His sleeping furs were undisturbed, suggesting he had left voluntarily rather than being taken by force. But none of his possessions were missing, including his bow and the hunting knife that had been his pride since his father had given it to him on his 10th birthday. The initial search had focused on the immediate area around their temporary camp. Near Owl Creek, Standing Bear's band had been traveling toward their winter grounds in the Absaroka Mountains, following routes that his people had used for generations. They knew every stream, every game trail, every landmark along the way. If Little Fox had simply wandered off or gotten lost in familiar territory, they should have found him within hours. When the first day's search proved fruitless, Standing Bear had expanded the effort, sending riders in wider and wider circles. They had found old tracks, probably several days old, that might have been Little Fox's moccasins, but the trail led toward unfamiliar territory to the east, toward the mining areas where white men had been disturbing the earth for several years. The discovery of these tracks had created a new dimension of worry for Standing Bear. Relations with the white settlers and miners had been tense but generally peaceful over the past year, maintained through a careful balance of mutual avoidance and cautious respect. The miners stayed near their diggings, the Lakota avoided those areas, and both sides went about their business without direct confrontation. But Standing Bear knew that this fragile peace was built on mistrust and misunderstanding. Many of the white men viewed all Indians as potential threats, while many of his own people saw the miners as invaders who defiled sacred lands and drove away game animals. It would take very little to upset this balance, and a missing Indian child near white settlements could easily provide that spark. On the second day of searching, one of Standing Bear's scouts had returned with disturbing news. He had found more definite traces of Little Fox's passage, including a distinctive bead from the boy's shirt, caught on a thorny bush near a creek that ran close to several mining claims. The trail led toward an area of abandoned mines and rough country that even experienced hunters avoided because of unstable ground and dangerous drop-offs. Standing Bear had immediately organized a more focused search of this area, but the terrain was treacherous and the abandoned mines were numerous. Many of the old shafts were partially collapsed or flooded, creating deadly traps for anyone unfamiliar with their hazards. The possibility that Little Fox had fallen into one of these forgotten holes filled the chief with a cold dread that he struggled to keep from showing to his men. The third day had brought the discovery that changed everything. White Hawk, one of Standing Bear's most skilled trackers, had found clear evidence that Little Fox had not simply fallen victim to an accident. Near the entrance to an abandoned copper mine, White Hawk had discovered signs of a struggle. Disturbed earth, broken vegetation, and most significantly, drops of blood that had been partially washed away by the recent storm but were still visible to experienced eyes. More troubling still were the other tracks White Hawk had found. Boot prints, clearly made by white men's footwear, overlapped with the area where the struggle had taken place. The tracks were recent, probably made within the last few days, and they suggested that at least 2 white men had been present during whatever had happened to Little Fox. Standing Bear had examined the evidence himself, and his warrior's instincts told him a story that filled him with cold rage. His son had been attacked, probably overpowered by multiple assailants, and then either killed outright or left to die in the abandoned mine. The storm had washed away much of the evidence and made tracking difficult, but enough remained to paint a clear picture of violence and betrayal. But White Hawk had found something else at the mine, something that complicated the simple narrative of white aggression against an innocent child. Fresh tracks, different from the boot prints, led away from the mine entrance toward the north. These were smaller tracks, made by someone with a lighter step, and they were accompanied by drag marks that suggested someone had been carrying or pulling a heavy burden. The tracker had followed these new tracks for nearly a mile before losing them on rocky ground, but their direction was clear. They led toward the area where several white settlers had built isolated cabins and small homesteads, living apart from the main mining camps and townships. White Hawk believed that whoever had made these tracks had been moving carefully, deliberately, as if trying to avoid detection. Standing Bear faced a decision that would have consequences far beyond his missing son. The evidence suggested that Little Fox had been attacked by white men and was possibly dead, but the newer tracks raised the possibility that someone else, perhaps another white person, had intervened. Whether this intervention was a rescue or simply the removal of evidence remained unclear. The chief called together his senior warriors for a council that lasted deep into the night. Grey Wolf, his eldest and most experienced war leader, advocated for immediate and decisive action. The white men had broken the unspoken peace by harming an innocent child, and the proper response was to gather the full war party and demand justice from the mining settlements. But Running Elk, Standing Bear's brother and the band's primary negotiator with white authorities, counseled caution. Without knowing Little Fox's exact fate or the identity of those responsible, attacking white settlements would accomplish nothing except escalating a conflict that could destroy both communities. Better to continue searching, to gather more information, and to pursue justice through methods that wouldn't result in war. Standing Bear listened to both perspectives, weighing his responsibilities as a father against his duties as a leader. His heart burned with the need for immediate action, for revenge against those who had harmed his son. But his mind recognized the wisdom in Running Elk's words. A premature attack based on incomplete information, could result in the deaths of many warriors and would certainly bring retaliation from the US Army. The decision he reached reflected both his grief and his leadership. He would take a selected group of his best warriors and follow the new tracks, seeking to learn Little Fox's fate and identify those responsible. If his son was dead, there would be justice. If he was alive and being held captive, there would be rescue. But the response would be measured and appropriate to the actual circumstances, not driven by rage and assumption. Dawn of the fourth day found Standing Bear and 20 of his warriors following White Hawk's careful tracking toward the scattered homesteads north of the mining area. The tracker had managed to pick up the trail again on softer ground, and the signs told a consistent story of someone moving with deliberate care while carrying a significant burden. As they rode, Standing Bear found himself thinking about his son's character and the choices that might have led to this crisis. Little Fox was curious about everything, including the white men who had come to their traditional lands. The boy had pestered his father with questions about the miners, their strange machines, their methods of pulling metal from the earth. Standing Bear had answered as best he could, but he had also warned his son to stay away from the white settlements. It was possible, the chief realized, that Little Fox's curiosity had overcome his caution. The boy might have decided to observe the white men's activities from a safe distance, only to be discovered and perceived as a threat. In the current atmosphere of mutual suspicion, even a child's innocent curiosity could be misinterpreted as scouting for a potential attack. The tracking became easier as they moved into an area of softer soil and scattered vegetation. White Hawk was able to determine that the person they were following had stopped several times, probably to rest, and that the burden being carried had definitely been a human being. Most significantly, some of the resting places showed signs that the burden had been alive and moving, not simply dead weight. This discovery sent a surge of hope through Standing Bear's chest. If Little Fox had been alive when someone carried him away from the mine, there was a good chance he was still alive. The question remained whether his removal from the mine had been rescue or capture, but at least the possibility of rescue existed. The trail led to a well-built log cabin situated in a small clearing beside a clear running stream. The cabin was isolated but not hidden, suggesting that its occupant was living alone but not trying to avoid contact with neighbors. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and there were signs of recent activity around the building. Fresh wood chips near a chopping, a block, recently washed clothes hanging on a line, a small garden that had been carefully tended. Standing Bear called a halt while they were still concealed in the surrounding trees, and he studied the cabin carefully through the morning light. This was clearly the end of the trail they had been following, but the situation required careful handling. If Little Fox was inside the cabin, his rescuer might be frightened into harmful action by the sudden appearance of armed warriors. If his captor was inside, a direct assault might result in the boy's death before they could reach him. The chief made his decision with the same careful deliberation he had used the night before. He would approach the cabin alone, under a flag of truce, to determine the situation before taking any action. His warriors would remain hidden but ready to respond if negotiation failed or if treachery was revealed. Standing Bear dismounted and removed his weapons, setting them aside in the traditional gesture of peaceful intent. He took a white cloth from his saddlebag and tied it to a stick, creating the recognized symbol of truce that both Indians and whites understood. Then, walking slowly and keeping his hands visible, he approached the cabin. He was still 50 yards from the building when the door opened and a woman stepped onto the small front porch. Standing Bear stopped immediately, surprised by this development. The tracker had never suggested that the person they were following was a woman. though he realized that the lighter footprints and careful movement patterns now made more sense. Woman was young, probably in her mid-20s, with the practical clothing and confident bearing of someone accustomed to frontier life. She was not armed, at least not visibly, but she stood with the alertness of someone who was aware of potential danger. Most importantly, she did not appear surprised or frightened by his appearance, suggesting that she had been expecting someone to come looking. Standing Bear raised his truce flag higher and called out in the few words of English he knew, "Talk, peace, boy." The woman nodded and gestured for him to come closer, but she remained on the porch where she would have the advantage of elevation and quick retreat into the cabin if necessary. When he was close enough for normal conversation, the woman spoke. "You first." "You're looking for the child," she said, her voice steady but not unfriendly. "He's alive, but he's been badly hurt. I found him in an old mine shaft and brought him here to recover." Standing Bear felt a wave of relief so powerful that it nearly buckled his knees, but he kept his expression neutral and his voice controlled. "My son," he said carefully. "Little Fox. You help him?" The woman nodded. "He was dying when I found him. Someone had beaten him and left him in the mine. I've been taking care of him for 2 days now. He's getting stronger, but he's still very weak." The chief absorbed this information, feeling the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. His son had been attacked, probably by the men whose bootprints White Hawk had found and left for dead in the abandoned mine. This woman had found him, rescued him, and was now caring for him at considerable risk to herself. "I want to see him," Standing Bear said, the English words coming slowly but clearly. The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "He's inside, sleeping. But I need you to understand something first. There are people who might not understand why I helped him, people who might think I had something to do with what happened to him. If you take him and leave peacefully, no one needs to know about any of this. But if there's violence, if anyone gets hurt, it will bring trouble for all of us." Standing Bear understood the wisdom in her words, but he also understood that the situation was more complicated than she realized. His warriors were watching from the trees, and they had been prepared for battle ever since the evidence of violence had been discovered at the mine. If he simply took his son and left, there would be questions about justice for those who had attacked the boy. But first, he needed to see Little Fox for himself, to assess his condition and hear his account of what had happened. Only then could he make decisions about what justice required. The woman stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Come in, but please move quietly. He needs his rest." As Standing Bear entered the cabin, he was struck by its cleanliness and organization. This was clearly the home of someone who lived alone, but took pride in maintaining proper standards. More importantly, the cabin smelled of medicinal herbs and healing remedies, confirming the woman's claim that she had been providing medical care. Little Fox was lying on a comfortable bed near the fireplace, covered with clean blankets and looking peaceful in sleep. His color was better than Standing Bear had dared to hope, and his breathing was steady and normal. The bandages on his visible wounds were clean and professionally applied, showing that his care had been skilled as well as compassionate. The boy's eyes opened as his father approached the bed, and Standing Bear saw recognition and relief flood across his son's face. "Father," Little Fox whispered in Lakota, his voice weak but clear. "I knew you would find me." Standing Bear knelt beside the bed and took his son's hand gently. "Tell me what happened," he said, also speaking in their native language. Little Fox's account, delivered in halting whispers, confirmed the story that the evidence had suggested. He had been exploring near the mining areas, curiosity overcoming caution, when he had been discovered by 2 white men who accused him of spying for a war party. Despite his attempts to explain that he was alone and meant no harm, They had beaten him severely and then dragged him to the abandoned mine, intending to leave him there to die as a warning to other Indians. But the boy had one more crucial piece of information. He'd heard the men talking about reporting to someone that they had dealt with the Indian problem, and he had heard them mention a name, Colonel Morrison, who ran one of the largest mining operations in the area. Standing Bear absorbed this information with growing anger, but also with the satisfaction of finally understanding the full scope of what had happened. His son had been the victim of deliberate violence, ordered or at least sanctioned by someone, in a position of authority within the white community. This was not a random act of brutality, but part of a larger pattern of hostility toward his people. The woman had been watching the conversation even though she couldn't understand the words, and she seemed to sense the tension building in Standing Bear's posture. "What did he tell you?" she asked quietly. Standing Bear looked at her for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. This woman had saved his son's life at considerable risk to herself, and she deserved to know the truth about what she had become involved in. But she was also white, and her reaction to learning about white men's guilt in the attack was unpredictable. "He tells me who hurt him," Standing Bear said finally. "White men who work for Colonel Morrison. They beat him and leave him to die, because they think he is a spy for the war party." The woman's face went pale, and Standing Bear saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. "Morrison," she said, and there was real anger in her voice. "I should have known. That man has been stirring up trouble ever since he arrived in the territory. He's been telling everyone that the Indians are planning attacks, that we need to take action before they strike first." This reaction surprised Standing Bear. He had expected defensiveness, denial, or at least the kind of automatic loyalty that people usually showed toward members of their own race. Instead, this woman seemed as angry about the attack on Little Fox as he was. "You know this Morrison?" he asked. The woman nodded grimly. "He owns the largest mining operation in the area, and he's been trying to force out all the smaller miners and settlers so he can expand his claims. He's also been pressuring the territorial government to remove all the Indian tribes from the region, claiming that your presence is a threat to development and safety." Standing Bear began to understand the larger picture. His son's attack wasn't just random violence. It was part of a deliberate campaign to create conflict between whites and Indians, conflict that could be used to justify the removal of his people from their traditional lands. But understanding the politics behind the attack raised new questions about justice and response. Simply punishing the two men who had beaten Little Fox would not address the larger threat posed by Morrison and his ambitions. Yet attacking Morrison directly would certainly bring military retaliation that could destroy Standing Bear's entire band. As he pondered these complexities, Standing Bear became aware that time was running short. His warriors had been waiting patiently in the woods, but they would expect him to emerge soon, with either his son or an explanation for delay. If he remained in the cabin much longer, they might assume something had gone wrong and take independent action. But he also realized that simply taking Little Fox and leaving would not resolve the situation. Morrison and his men would eventually learn that the boy had survived, and they would want to know who had rescued him and where he had been hidden. This woman would be in serious danger once they made that connection. Standing Bear faced a decision that would affect not just his son's safety, but the delicate balance of power in the entire region. The choice he made in the next few minutes could determine whether justice was served or whether a larger conflict erupted that would consume both communities. Outside, unknown to the woman who had saved his son, 49 more Lakota warriors were making their way toward the cabin, having been summoned by the signal fires that Standing Bear's original party had lit when they discovered the trail. By sunset, 50 of the tribe's finest warriors would surround the little cabin, and the fate of everyone inside would hang on the wisdom of the decisions made in these crucial hours. Sarah Mitchell had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize the subtle signs that meant survival or death. The way Chief Standing Bear's eyes had hardened when his son mentioned Colonel Morrison's name told her that this situation was about to become far more dangerous than a simple rescue and recovery. She watched the chief's face as he processed the information, seeing calculations and decisions being made that would affect everyone in the territory. "There's something else you need to know," Sarah said quietly, moving to the window and carefully peering through the curtains. "Morrison has been planning something big. I've heard rumors from some of the miners who work for smaller operations. He's been stockpiling weapons and ammunition, claiming it's for protection against Indian raids that haven't happened." Standing, Bear followed her to the window, his movements careful and controlled. "What kind of planning?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that what she was about to reveal could change everything. "He's been meeting with territorial officials, trying to convince them that the tribes need to be relocated immediately for everyone's safety. But some of the miners think he's planning to create the very incidents he's been warning about, attacks that would justify military intervention." The chief absorbed this information with the stoic expression that Sarah was beginning to recognize as his way of processing complex threats. She could see him weighing options, considering consequences, trying to find a path through a situation that seemed to offer only dangerous choices. "My warriors wait in the forest," Standing Bear said finally. "They expect justice for my son. If I tell them about Morrison, about the planning you describe, they will want to strike first before he can act." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How many warriors?" 20 came with me, but signal fires were lit when we found the trail to your cabin. By sunset, 50 of our finest fighters will be here." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. 50 Lakota warriors surrounded her isolated cabin, angry about the attack on their chief's son, and armed with the knowledge that Colonel Morrison was planning larger actions against their people. This was exactly the kind of situation that could explode into the very conflict Morrison seemed to be orchestrating. But even as fear crept up her spine, Sarah's mind was working on solutions. She had grown up hearing stories of frontier diplomacy, of brave individuals who had prevented wars through creative thinking and courageous action. Her own grandfather had been a negotiator during conflicts with various tribes in Pennsylvania, and he had taught her that the key to peace was often finding ways for all parties to achieve their most important goals without destroying each other. "There might be another way," she said slowly, the idea forming as she spoke. "What if we could expose Morrison's real plans before he can act on them? What if we could prove to the territorial authorities that he's been orchestrating violence to serve his own interests?" Standing Bear studied her face, looking for signs of deception or naive optimism. "You think white authorities would believe accusations against Morrison? You think they would side with Indians against one of their own people?" Sarah met his gaze, steadily. "I think they would believe the evidence. Morrison has been careless because he thinks no one is paying attention to his activities. But I've been keeping records of strange things I've observed, and I'm not the only one who's been suspicious of his motives." She moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin and retrieved a leather portfolio filled with papers. "I've been documenting unusual shipments of weapons and supplies to Morrison's operation, meetings with men who aren't miners, conversations. I've overheard about dealing with the Indian problem. I started keeping these records because something felt wrong, but I didn't know what to do with the information." Standing Bear examined the papers, unable to read the English writing, but clearly recognizing the systematic nature of Sarah's documentation. "Why do you do this? Why do you care about problems between Morrison and my people?" It was a fair question, And Sarah realized that her answer would determine whether this man trusted her enough to consider alternatives to violence. Because I believe that what's happening here is wrong, and because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while bad people gain power. My grandfather used to say that evil succeeds when decent folks convince themselves that someone else's problems aren't their concern. Little Fox stirred on the bed, drawing both adults' attention. The boy was awake and listening, though he was clearly still weak from his ordeal. He spoke quietly in Lakota to his father, and Sarah watched. Standing Bear's expression changed as he listened to his son's words. "What did he say?" Sarah asked. Standing Bear looked at her with something that might have been respect. "He says that you saved his life when you could have left him to die. He says that means you are family now, and family helps family fight their enemies." The simple logic of a child's gratitude cut through the complex political considerations that had been dominating Sarah's thoughts. She had saved this boy because it was the right thing to do, without considering the larger implications. Now those implications were threatening to overwhelm all of them, but maybe the solution was to return to that same simple principle, doing what was right, regardless of the consequences. "Then we help each other," Sarah said firmly. "But we do it smart, not just brave. Morrison is expecting Indians to react with violence to provocation. He's probably counting on it. What if we gave him something he's not expecting instead?" Before Standing Bear could respond, a soft whistle came from outside the cabin, clearly a signal from one of the hidden warriors. The chief moved quickly to the window and peered out, then relaxed slightly. "More of my men arrive," he explained to Sarah. "The signal says they come in peace, but they will want to know what happens here." Sarah made a quick decision. "Bring them in, all of them. If we're going to work together, they need to hear what we're planning." Standing Bear looked surprised. "You want 50 Lakota warriors inside your cabin?" "I want 50 potential allies, to understand that we have a common enemy and a chance to defeat him without starting a war that will hurt everyone we care about." The chief considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. He went to the door and gave a series of whistled signals. Within minutes, warriors began emerging from the forest, moving with the fluid grace of men who were completely comfortable in wilderness settings. They were armed and painted for battle, but they approached the cabin with disciplined restraint, clearly responding to their chief's leadership. Sarah had never seen so many Lakota warriors at close range, and she was struck by their diversity. Some were young men barely out of their teens. Others were grizzled veterans with scars that spoke of many battles. Their weapons ranged from traditional bows and war clubs to modern rifles and revolvers that had been acquired through trade or conflict. But all of them shared the same focused intensity, the alertness of predators who were ready for violence but disciplined enough to wait for the right moment. Standing Bear spoke to his men in rapid Lakota, explaining the situation and Sarah's role in rescuing Little Fox. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could read the reactions on the warriors' faces. Surprise, skepticism, anger at the news about Morrison's involvement, and gradually a cautious willingness to listen to alternatives to immediate retaliation. One of the older warriors, distinguished by elaborate feathers and paint that marked him as a leader, stepped forward and spoke directly to Standing Bear. The conversation was intense but controlled, clearly a debate about strategy and honor between men who respected each other's judgment. "Grey Wolf wants to know why we should trust a white woman's plan when white men have just tried to murder my son," Standing Bear translated for Sarah's benefit. "He says that Morrison and his men understand only strength, and that showing weakness will invite more attacks." Sarah nodded, understanding the logic behind the warrior's position. "Ask Grey Wolf if he thinks Morrison wants us to attack his mining operation. Ask him if he thinks Morrison has been preparing for exactly that kind of response." Standing Bear translated, and Sarah saw Grey Wolf's expression change as he considered the implications of her questions. The older warrior spoke again, more thoughtfully this time. "He says that a trap is still a trap even when you can see it," Standing Bear reported. "But he wants to know what alternative you propose that doesn't leave Morrison free to attack other children." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine whether diplomacy or warfare shaped the next chapter of this conflict. "We expose Morrison's conspiracy to the territorial governor and the military commander at Fort Bridger simultaneously. We provide evidence of his deliberate provocation, his stockpiling of weapons, and his attempts to create incidents that would justify military action against your people. And we do it in a way that makes it impossible for him to claim that the evidence was fabricated by hostile Indians." The warriors listened intently as Standing Bear translated, and Sarah could see them weighing the proposal against their instincts. For direct action, she pressed on, outlining the plan that was forming in her mind. Morrison's strength comes from his ability to manipulate the authorities by playing on their fears of Indian violence. But what if those same authorities received documented proof that Morrison has been manufacturing those incidents? What if they learned that he's been planning to attack settlements and blame the attacks on Indians? What if respectable white citizens came forward to testify about his conspiracy? Grey Wolf spoke again, and this time Sarah could hear a note of interest in his voice, even though she couldn't understand his words. "He asks how you would get this evidence to the authorities without Morrison learning about it and silencing the witnesses," Standing Bear translated. Sarah smiled for the first time since this crisis had begun, because Morrison thinks he's the only one who's been planning ahead. "He doesn't know that my brother Thomas has been corresponding with territorial officials about irregularities in mining claims and suspicious activities by large operations. He doesn't know that Captain Henderson at Fort Bridger has been asking and questions about unusual weapon shipments in the region. And he definitely doesn't know that the territorial governor has been receiving complaints about Morrison's intimidation tactics from multiple sources." She could see that she had the warriors' attention now, that they were beginning to understand the scope of what she was proposing. Morrison's conspiracy only works if he can control the narrative about what's happening here. But what if the real story reaches the authorities before he can spin his version of events? Standing Bear and Grey Wolf exchanged a long look, communicating in the way of men who had fought together for years. Finally, the chief turned back to Sarah. "Grey Wolf says that your plan has merit, but it requires trusting white authorities to act with justice toward Indians. He asks what guarantees you can offer that these officials won't simply use your evidence to justify taking action against all tribes in the region." It was a sophisticated objection that showed how well these men understood the political realities of their situation. Sarah realized that her plan would only work if she could address their legitimate concerns about the trustworthiness of territorial authorities. "No guarantees," she said honestly, "but consider the alternative. If Morrison succeeds in provoking a war, the army will be called in anyway, and they'll have justification for removing all Indians from the territory. At least with my plan, we're offering the authorities a way to solve their problems without warfare, by removing the source of instability rather than the people being victimized by it." As Standing Bear translated this response, Sarah saw several of the younger warriors nodding in understanding. They were beginning to grasp the strategic logic of her proposal, even if they weren't entirely comfortable with its reliance on white justice. But Grey Wolf had one more question, delivered in a tone that suggested it was a test of Sarah's commitment to her own plan. "He wants to know what you're willing to risk to make this work," Standing Bear said. "Words are easy, but this plan requires you to stand against your own people and accuse them of crimes against Indians. Grey Wolf asks if you're prepared for the consequences if Morrison learns what you're doing." Sarah looked around the cabin. At the assembled warriors, at Little Fox recovering on his bed, at Standing Bear waiting for her answer. She thought about her comfortable life in Philadelphia, about the safe choices she could have made that would have kept her far from this. Moment of decision. Morrison's men already tried to murder a child, she said quietly. If I do nothing, they'll try again, and eventually they'll succeed in starting the war they want. I've already crossed the line by saving Little Fox. Now I'm going to finish what I started. The warriors listened to the translation of her words, and Sarah could see the shift in their attitudes. She was no longer just a white woman who had happened to help their chief's son. She was someone who had chosen to stand with them against a common enemy despite the personal cost. Standing Bear spoke briefly to his men, then turned back to Sarah. We will try your plan, but we do it with conditions. My warriors will remain here, surrounding your cabin, while you contact the authorities. If Morrison discovers what we're doing and tries to silence you or attack my people, we will be ready to respond. And if your plan fails, if the white authorities choose to side with Morrison despite the evidence, then we act according to our own judgment. Sarah nodded, understanding that this was as much cooperation as she could reasonably expect. How long do we have before Morrison realizes that Little Fox survived and starts looking for him? Not long, Standing Bear admitted. His men will return to the mine to make sure the boy is dead. When they find the chamber empty and see signs that someone removed him, they will begin searching. Morrison is not a fool. He will understand that whoever saved Little Fox knows about the attack. Sarah felt the weight of time pressure adding urgency to their already dangerous situation. Then we move fast. I'll ride to Fort Bridger to contact Captain Henderson while you send messengers to the territorial capital with evidence for the governor. We coordinate our approaches so that both officials receive the information simultaneously before Morrison can get to them with his version of events. As the plan took shape, Sarah found herself marveling at the strange circumstances that had brought her to this moment. 3 days ago, she had been a simple mining surveyor, concerned primarily with geological formations and mineral deposits. Now she was coordinating a complex political strategy with 50 Lakota warriors, preparing to take on one of the most powerful men in the territory. But as she looked at Little Fox, still pale but clearly recovering from his ordeal, Sarah knew that some choices were worth any risk. The boy had been targeted for violence simply because of who he was, and that kind of injustice couldn't be allowed to stand unchallenged. The question now was whether courage and careful planning would be enough to overcome the forces that Morrison had been putting in motion. As night fell over the Wind River Range, 50 warriors took positions around Sarah's cabin, and the most dangerous gamble of her life was about to begin. Captain James Henderson had commanded the garrison at Fort Bridger for 3 years, long enough to develop an instinct for distinguishing between routine frontier problems and situations that could explode into territory-wide conflicts. When Sarah Mitchell arrived at his office before dawn, mud splattered from a hard night's ride and carrying a portfolio of documents that she claimed would prevent a war, every one of those instincts started screaming warnings. Henderson was a career soldier who had served in conflicts from the Mexican War to recent Indian campaigns, and he had learned to be skeptical of civilians who claimed to have solutions to complex military problems. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't a typical frontier settler seeking military protection from imagined threats. Her brother's mining operation had a solid reputation, and the few times Henderson had met her, she had impressed him with her practical intelligence and careful observations about territorial politics. "Start from the beginning," Henderson said, pouring coffee for both of them in his Spartan office, "and don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." Sarah had rehearsed this conversation during her midnight ride to the fort, knowing that she would have only one chance: to convince the captain that immediate action was necessary. She began with her discovery of Little Fox in the mine shaft, but she focused on the evidence rather than the emotions of the rescue. The boy's injuries were deliberate and systematic, she explained, showing Henderson the sketches she had made of the wounds. This wasn't a random attack or even a panicked response to discovering an Indian child. Someone took time to beat him thoroughly before dumping him in that mine to die. Henderson examined the sketches with the clinical attention of someone who had seen plenty of violence. These injuries are consistent with what you're describing, but one child's testimony about his attackers wouldn't normally justify military intervention. What makes this different? Sarah opened her portfolio and began laying out the documentation she had been compiling over the past months. Purchase orders for unusual quantities of weapons and ammunition, records of meetings between Morrison and men who weren't involved in mining operations, transcripts of conversations she had overheard about creating incidents that would force the government's hand on the Indian question. Morrison hasn't been preparing to defend against Indian attacks, Sarah said quietly. He's been preparing to stage Indian attacks. The assault on Little Fox wasn't an isolated incident. It was a test run for something much larger. The captain studied the documents with growing concern. As a military officer, he was trained to recognize the signs of organized conspiracy, and what Sarah had documented showed all the hallmarks of a coordinated campaign to manufacture justification for military action. These purchase orders are genuine, Henderson said, recognizing the signatures of legitimate suppliers. And these meeting reports are detailed enough to be credible. But why are you bringing this to me instead of to territorial authorities? Sarah leaned forward, knowing that her next words would determine whether Henderson took immediate action or followed bureaucratic procedures that would give Morrison time to act first. Because Morrison is meeting with territorial officials right now, probably telling them that Indians have killed settlers and that immediate military response is necessary. By the time normal channels process my evidence, Morrison's version of events will already be accepted as fact. Henderson felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with recognizing a developing crisis. If Sarah's information was accurate, he was facing exactly the kind of manufactured emergency that could spiral into regional warfare before anyone had time to sort out the truth from the lies. What specific action are you requesting? Henderson asked. Send a patrol to Morrison's main operation immediately. Arrest him and his associates on charges of conspiracy to incite violence. Secure the weapons and ammunition he's been stockpiling. And send word to territorial headquarters that any reports of Indian attacks should be investigated carefully before military response is authorized. It was a reasonable plan, but Henderson knew it carried enormous risks. If Sarah's accusations proved false, arresting Morrison would create a political crisis that could end the captain's career. But if her accusations were true and he failed to act, the resulting conflict could cost hundreds of lives. The decision was made easier by a commotion outside Henderson's office. His aide knocked urgently on the door, then entered without waiting. For permission, a breach of protocol that indicated a serious emergency. Captain, we have a priority message from territorial headquarters, the aide reported breathlessly. Morrison sent word that Indians have attacked his operation and killed 3 of his men. He's requesting immediate military support to pursue the attackers. Henderson and Sarah exchanged grim looks. Morrison was moving faster than they had anticipated, already putting his false flag operation into motion while they were still trying to expose his conspiracy. What's the status of our patrol units? Henderson asked his aide. First Cavalry is ready for immediate deployment, sir. They're waiting for orders to ride to Morrison's operation. Henderson made his decision with the kind of quick calculation that separated effective commanders from those who got people killed while they deliberated. Send word to territorial headquarters that we're investigating reports of attacks in our sector. but that initial patrol reports are inconsistent with Morrison's claims. Tell them we're conducting a thorough investigation before recommending a military response." The aide looked confused by these orders, which contradicted normal procedures for responding to reports of settler deaths. "Sir, shouldn't we deploy immediately if civilians have been killed?" "Not until we verify exactly what happened and who was responsible," Henderson said firmly. "And bring me the personnel files for our most reliable scouts. We're going to need independent verification of the situation at Morrison's operation." As the aide hurried out to execute these orders, Henderson turned back to Sarah. "Your timing is either remarkably coincidental or Morrison is moving even faster than you anticipated. Either way, we're past the point where this can be handled through normal channels." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. Henderson was taking her seriously and preparing to act on her information, but Morrison's preemptive strike meant that events were accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control them carefully. "There's something else you need to know," Sarah said. "Chief Standing Bear and 50 of his warriors are currently surrounding my cabin, where his injured son is recovering. They know about Morrison's conspiracy, and they're prepared to take direct action if they believe the authorities won't deliver justice." Henderson absorbed this information with the stoic expression of a soldier who had just learned that a bad situation was actually much worse than he had initially understood. "So we're not just dealing with Morrison's false flag operation, we're also dealing with 50 angry Lakota warriors who are ready for war if they don't see results from our investigation." "They're not looking for war," Sarah said quickly. "Standing Bear is a leader who understands the costs of conflict. But they won't stand by while Morrison manufactures justification for military action against their people. If we can expose Morrison's conspiracy quickly enough, the warriors will return to their territories peacefully. But if Morrison succeeds in convincing the territorial government that Indians are attacking settlers," Henderson didn't need her to finish the sentence. He had seen what happened when frontier tensions exploded into open conflict, and he knew that once violence started, it became almost impossible to contain. "How do I contact Standing Bear directly?" Henderson asked. Sarah was surprised by the question. Military officers, in her experience, typically refused to negotiate with Indian leaders, preferring to work through official channels that often ignored Native American perspectives entirely. "You want to talk to him personally?" "I want to understand his position and his intentions before this situation gets completely out of hand," Henderson replied. "If Morrison is trying to manufacture a war, then Standing Bear and I are on the same side whether we realize it or not. Better to coordinate our efforts than to let Morrison manipulate us into fighting each other." This was exactly the kind of thinking that Sarah had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. Henderson was demonstrating the kind of practical wisdom that could prevent catastrophe if they could act quickly enough. "I can guide you to my cabin," Sarah offered. "But you should know that 50 armed warriors surrounding a military officer could be misinterpreted in dangerous ways if Morrison's allies see us together." Henderson was already reaching for his field equipment. "Then we better move fast enough that Morrison doesn't have time to spin whatever meeting takes place." Within an hour, Henderson and a small escort of his most trusted soldiers were riding hard toward Sarah's cabin, while other units moved to positions that would allow them to investigate Morrison's claims independently. The captain had also sent coded messages to territorial headquarters and to other military commanders in the region, alerting them to the possibility that reports of Indian attacks might be fabricated. As they neared Sarah's cabin, Henderson could see signs of the Lakota presence even though the warriors remained expertly concealed. Disturbed vegetation, barely visible tracks, and the kind of subtle environmental changes that spoke of organized human activity in areas that should have been empty wilderness. "They know we're coming," Henderson observed. "They've known since. We were still 3 miles away," Sarah replied. "Standing Bear has scouts positioned throughout this area. The question is whether they see us as allies or threats." The answer came when they were still a 1/4 mile from the cabin. Standing Bear himself emerged from concealment, alone and unarmed, walking directly toward their small column with the confident bearing of a man who knew his warriors had Henderson's. Party completely surrounded. Henderson called a halt and dismounted, following the chief's example by setting aside his weapons in a gesture of peaceful intent. The 2 leaders met in the open ground between Sarah's cabin and the forest, with Sarah translating when necessary. "Chief Standing Bear," Henderson began. "I'm Captain Henderson from Fort Bridger. Miss Mitchell has told me about the attack on your son and about Colonel Morrison's conspiracy. I want to work with you to prevent the war that Morrison is trying to start." Standing Bear studied Henderson's face carefully, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. "Why should I trust a soldier's words when soldiers' weapons will be used against my people if Morrison's lies are believed?" It was a fair question that went to the heart of the trust problem between military authorities and Indian leaders. Henderson chose his words carefully, knowing that his response could determine whether diplomacy or violence shaped the next few hours. "Because Morrison's lies will be used to justify actions that I know are wrong, and because preventing unjust war is part of my duty as a soldier," Henderson replied. "I've seen what happens when conflicts start based on manufactured evidence. Innocent people die on both sides, and the only winners are those who profit from chaos." Standing Bear nodded slowly, recognizing the sincerity in Henderson's voice. "What do you propose?" Henderson outlined his plan to expose Morrison's conspiracy through coordinated action between military investigators and tribal witnesses. "We document Morrison's false claims about attacks on his operation. We present evidence of his weapons stockpiling and his meetings with conspirators. And we do it publicly enough that territorial authorities can't ignore the facts, even if they wanted to." "And if Morrison's influence with the territorial government is stronger than your evidence?" Standing Bear asked. Henderson met the chief's gaze directly. "Then we make sure that other military commanders and federal authorities know what really happened here. Morrison may have influence at the territorial level, but he can't control everyone, and there are people in Washington who won't tolerate manufactured wars on the frontier." As the 2 leaders talked, Sarah became aware that time was running critically short. Morrison's false reports were probably already reaching territorial headquarters, and every minute of delay gave him more opportunity to solidify his version of events before contradictory evidence could be presented. "We need to move now," she interrupted. "Morrison's people are probably already discovering that Little Fox survived and that someone rescued him. Once they start looking for him, it won't take long to trace him back to my cabin." Standing Bear turned to her with an expression of grim acknowledgement. "My scouts report that armed white men are already searching abandoned mines and asking questions at settlements near the Copper Ridge area. They will be here before sunset." Henderson felt the familiar pre-battle tension that came with recognizing that careful planning was about to give way to immediate action. "How many men is Morrison likely to bring?" "My scouts count at least 20. Armed riders moving in our direction," Standing Bear replied, "but Morrison himself is not with them. He remains at his main operation, probably preparing to claim that any fighting here was unprovoked Indian aggression." The tactical situation was becoming clear to Henderson. Morrison had sent enough men to overwhelm Sarah's cabin and eliminate the witnesses to his conspiracy, while keeping himself at a safe distance so that he could claim innocence when the shooting started. It was a clever plan that would accomplish Morrison's goals while giving him plausible deniability. But Morrison had made one critical miscalculation. He had planned for the possibility that his attack on Little Fox might be discovered, and he had prepared to silence any witnesses. What he hadn't planned for was the possibility that his conspiracy would be exposed to military authorities before his clean-up operation could be completed. "We end this now," Henderson said firmly. "Chief Standing Bear, are your warriors prepared to help me arrest Morrison's men when they arrive?" Standing Bear smiled for the first time since the crisis had begun. "Captain Henderson, my warriors have been prepared for that since we learned who hurt my son. The question is whether you're prepared to explain to territorial authorities why you chose to work with Indians against white settlers." Henderson returned the smile with equal grimness. "I'm prepared to explain that I chose to work with honest people against criminals, regardless of race. And I'm prepared to face the consequences of that choice." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Wind River Range, 50 Lakota warriors and a detachment of U.S. cavalry prepared for the confrontation that would determine whether Morrison's conspiracy succeeded or whether justice would prevail despite the political complexities of frontier life. Sarah looked out from her cabin window at the unlikely alliance that had formed around her kitchen table, and she realized that sometimes the most important battles were fought not between armies, but between different visions of what America could become. In a few hours, they would all learn which vision would triumph. The sun was setting behind the Wind River peaks when Morrison's riders finally appeared on the ridge overlooking Sarah's cabin. 22 armed men, led by Jake Brennan and Pete Sullivan, the same two who had beaten Little Fox and left him for dead in the Copper Ridge mine. They rode with the casual arrogance of men who believed they were conducting a simple cleanup operation, eliminating witnesses to a crime that the authorities would never investigate. Brennan raised his hand to halt the column while he studied the cabin below. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and he could see a horse tethered near the front door, but the clearing appeared otherwise empty. No signs of the Indian war party that Morrison had warned them might be protecting the rescued boy. "Looks quiet enough," Sullivan muttered, checking his rifle. "Woman's probably alone with the kid. We finish this quick and get back to Morrison with proof that the Indian problem's been solved." But Jake Brennan had survived 10 years on the frontier by paying attention to details that less experienced men missed. Something about the scene below felt wrong, though he couldn't identify exactly what was bothering him. The cabin looked too peaceful, too normal for a place that should be harboring a rescued Indian child and probably expecting trouble. "Keep your eyes open," Brennan warned his men. "This feels too easy." What Brennan couldn't see from his vantage point was the carefully coordinated positioning of 50 Lakota warriors and 6 cavalry soldiers around the cabin's perimeter. Captain Henderson had spent the afternoon working with Standing Bear to plan an ambush that would capture Morrison's men alive while minimizing the risk of bloodshed that could complicate the political aftermath. Inside the cabin, Sarah was tending to Little Fox, who had insisted on staying awake to witness whatever was about to happen. The boy was still weak, but his eyes were bright with the fierce pride of someone who was about to see his attackers face justice. "They're coming," Henderson said quietly, watching through a gap in the curtains. 20+ riders, probably. "Armed for a fight," Standing Bear nodded, his hand moving to the war club at his belt. "My warriors are ready. But remember our agreement. We take them alive if possible. Dead men cannot testify about Morrison's orders." Henderson appreciated the chief's tactical thinking. Living witnesses who could implicate Morrison in conspiracy would be far more valuable than martyrs who could be portrayed as victims of Indian aggression. The plan they had developed was elegantly simple. Henderson would emerge from the cabin alone, identifying himself as a military officer investigating reports of violence in the area. If Morrison's men tried to withdraw peacefully, they would be allowed to leave under surveillance. But if they attempted to carry out their mission to eliminate witnesses, they would find themselves surrounded by superior forces with no possibility of escape. Brennan's column reached the edge of the clearing just as Henderson stepped onto the cabin's front porch, wearing his full military uniform and carrying his service revolver prominently displayed but not drawn. "That's far enough," Henderson called out. "I'm Captain Henderson, U.S. Army. State your business here." Brennan felt his stomach drop as he recognized the implications of a military officer's presence at their target location. Morrison had assured them that the army wouldn't become involved in what he described as a local matter between settlers and Indians. "Captain," Brennan replied, trying to keep his voice steady, "we're looking for a missing Indian boy who was seen in this area. We have reports that he might be injured and need assistance." Henderson almost smiled at the transparent lie. "That's interesting, Mr. Brennan, because I have reports that you and Mr. Sullivan beat that same boy nearly to death and left him to die in an abandoned mine shaft. I also have evidence that you're here on Colonel Morrison's orders to eliminate witnesses to that attack." The accusation hit Brennan like a physical blow. How could this army captain know about their mission or about what had happened at the mine? Morrison had guaranteed that there were no witnesses to their actions and that the boy would never be found alive. Sullivan, always quicker to violence than to thinking, reached for his rifle. "Captain or no captain, you're interfering with civilian business that's none of the Army's concern." "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Henderson said calmly. At his words, the forest around the clearing suddenly came alive with armed figures. Lakota warriors emerged from concealment with the fluid grace of predators, their weapons trained on Morrison's riders. Simultaneously, Henderson's cavalry soldiers appeared from positions that gave them clear fields of fire across the entire clearing. Morrison's men found themselves surrounded by a force that outnumbered them more than 2-1, with no possibility of escape and no cover from the devastating crossfire they would face if shooting started. "Drop your weapons," Henderson ordered. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, assault with intent to murder, and inciting violence between civilian populations." Several of Morrison's men immediately complied, recognizing the hopelessness of their position. But Brennan and Sullivan, realizing that arrest would mean exposure of Morrison's entire conspiracy, chose to fight rather than surrender. Brennan's rifle shot echoed across the clearing as he aimed at Henderson, but the captain had already dropped behind the cabin's front steps. The shot that would have killed Henderson instead splintered the wooden door behind him. What followed was less a battle than a controlled demolition of Morrison's strike force, the Lakota warriors fighting with the precision of men defending. Their chief's son picked off Morrison's riders with devastating accuracy. Henderson's cavalry soldiers, positioned to prevent escape rather than to inflict casualties, captured fleeing men as they tried to reach the forest. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. When the shooting stopped, 12 of Morrison's men were dead, including Brennan and Sullivan, and the remaining 10 were prisoners. Not a single member of the defending force had been seriously wounded. Standing Bear emerged from the forest where he had been coordinating his warriors' movements. "It is finished," he said simply. Henderson surveyed the aftermath with mixed feelings. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the political consequences of the confrontation were just beginning. He had just presided over a battle in which U.S. cavalry soldiers had fought, alongside Lakota warriors against other white settlers, regardless of the justification. "We need to secure Morrison before he learns what happened here," Henderson said. "Once word gets out that his strike force was destroyed, he'll either run or try to accelerate whatever larger plan he's been developing." Standing Bear nodded in agreement. "My fastest riders can reach Morrison's operation before sunrise, but we need proof of his conspiracy that white authorities will accept, not just the word of Indians and one army captain." Sarah, who had been caring for Little Fox throughout the battle, finally spoke up. "We have that proof. Morrison's surviving men will testify to save themselves from hanging, and I still have all the documentation of his conspiracy. But more importantly, we now have something Morrison never expected: a joint statement from military and tribal authorities about what really happened here. Henderson understood immediately what she was suggesting: a coordinated report to territorial and federal authorities, signed by both military and tribal leaders, documenting Morrison's attempt to manufacture war through false flag operations. It was a politically brilliant solution. Morrison's power had been based on his ability to play different authorities against each other, convincing each that the others were unreliable sources of information about frontier conflicts. But a joint military-tribal report would be impossible for territorial authorities to dismiss or manipulate. Over the next several hours, as prisoners were secured and evidence was documented, Henderson and Standing Bear worked together to craft a comprehensive account of Morrison's conspiracy. The report detailed the attack on Little Fox, the stockpiling of weapons for false flag operations, the attempt to eliminate witnesses, and the coordinated response that had prevented Morrison's plan from succeeding. But even as they worked on the political solution, Henderson knew that Morrison himself remained dangerous. A man who had invested so much in creating conflict wouldn't simply accept defeat and withdraw peacefully. The answer to that concern came just before dawn, when one of Standing Bear's scouts returned with urgent news. Morrison had indeed learned about the failure of his strike force, but instead of fleeing, he had accelerated his timeline for creating the Indian war he needed to justify his actions. Morrison's main force is moving toward the Shoshone winter camps near Fort Washakie. Standing Bear translated the scout's report. 40 armed men with weapons and supplies for an extended campaign. They plan to attack the camps and leave evidence that will implicate my people in the massacre. Henderson felt his blood turn cold. Morrison was attempting to create an atrocity so horrific that it would justify military retaliation regardless of any evidence about his conspiracy. If he succeeded in massacring Shoshone families and making it appear to be Lakota aggression, no amount of documentation would prevent the war that would follow. "How long do we have?" Henderson asked. "My scout says Morrison's men will reach the Shoshone camps by midday tomorrow," Standing Bear replied. "But the camps are 40 miles from here, through difficult terrain." Sarah looked up from her work, documenting evidence. "There's another way. The old mining road that connects to the Fort Washakie supply route. It's rough, but it's direct. We could reach the Shoshone camps before Morrison if we leave immediately." Henderson made his decision with the same quick certainty that had served him throughout the crisis. "Chief Standing Bear, are your warriors willing to ride with my soldiers to prevent Morrison from massacring innocent people?" Standing Bear's answer came without hesitation. "Captain Henderson, my warriors will ride with your soldiers to stop any man who would murder children to serve his own ambition." As the sun rose over the Wind River Range, an unprecedented column began moving along the old mining road toward Fort Washakie. 25 Lakota warriors rode alongside 6 U.S. cavalry soldiers, led by a Lakota chief and an army captain who had found common ground in their determination to prevent manufactured war. Sarah remained at her cabin with Little Fox and a small guard force, coordinating communications with territorial authorities and federal officials. Her documentation of Morrison's conspiracy was already on its way to Washington, carried by military couriers who would ensure that the true story reached decision-makers before Morrison's version could take hold. The race to prevent Morrison's final atrocity lasted throughout the day. Henderson's combined force pushed their horses to the limit, following trails that tested both human and animal endurance. But their motivation was clear: Failure would mean the deaths of innocent families and the beginning of a regional war that could consume the entire territory. They reached the Shoshone winter camps just as Morrison's men were positioning themselves for their planned attack. The massacre was prevented not through a dramatic battle, but through Morrison's sudden realization that his entire conspiracy had been exposed and that continuing would only add mass murder to the charges he already faced. Confronted by the combined military tribal force and the knowledge that his political protection had evaporated, Morrison finally surrendered. His arrest, along with the testimony of his surviving conspirators, provided the final evidence needed to expose the full scope of his attempt to manufacture war for personal gain. The aftermath of the Morrison conspiracy became a turning point. In territorial politics, the joint military-tribal cooperation that had prevented Morrison's war became a model for resolving other frontier conflicts through collaboration rather than violence. Captain Henderson received commendation for his innovative approach to preventing manufactured conflicts, while Chief Standing Bear became recognized as a leader whose wisdom had prevented unnecessary bloodshed. Sarah Mitchell returned to her geological surveys, but her role in exposing Morrison's conspiracy made her a respected voice in territorial affairs. She continued to live in her isolated cabin, but now it was a place of respect rather than exile, visited by both white and Native American leaders seeking her counsel on matters requiring careful judgment and moral courage. Little Fox recovered completely from his injuries and grew up to become a bridge between cultures, speaking both English and Lakota fluently and serving as a translator and negotiator in the complex political landscape of the developing West. The scars from his ordeal became symbols not of victimization, but of survival and the possibility of justice. Even in seemingly hopeless circumstances, Morrison himself was convicted of conspiracy to incite violence and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His mining empire was dissolved, with his assets used to compensate the families he had harmed and to fund programs that promoted peaceful coexistence between different communities in the territory. The story of the dying Lakota child found in a mine shaft became legendary throughout the West, not because of the violence it contained, but because of the cooperation it inspired. It proved that even in the harsh realities of frontier life, people could choose justice over revenge, truth over manipulation, and courage over convenience. And in a small cabin beside a clear mountain stream, where 50 warriors had once gathered to seek justice for an injured child, the lessons of that choice continued to echo through the generations that followed. 3 months after Morrison's arrest, Sarah Mitchell stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., her leather portfolio containing documents that would reshape federal Indian policy for decades to come. The marble halls of the Capitol building felt surreal after the rough-hewn logs of her Wyoming cabin, but the stakes of her testimony were just as high as they had been during those desperate days when 50 warriors surrounded her home. Congressman William Hayes of Massachusetts, chairman of the House Committee on Territories, studied Sarah with the careful attention of a politician who understood that her story could either validate or devastate current federal policies toward Western tribes. The other committee members, representatives from states both Eastern and Western, waited with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. "Miss Mitchell," Chairman Hayes began, "you claim that a private citizen attempted to manufacture a war between federal forces and the Lakota tribe for personal financial gain. These are serious accusations that, if true, suggest fundamental problems with how we manage territorial affairs." Sarah had spent the train journey from Wyoming preparing for this moment, knowing that her testimony would be scrutinized by people who had never experienced frontier life, but whose decisions would determine the fate of thousands of families. both white and Native American. Congressman Hayes, what I witnessed wasn't an attempt to manufacture war. It was a systematic conspiracy that nearly succeeded in creating exactly the kind of conflict that has devastated other regions of the frontier. The only reason it failed was because people on both sides chose cooperation over the cycle of violence that Colonel Morrison was trying to establish. Representative Thomas Bradford of Colorado, a man whose own state had experienced brutal conflicts between settlers and various tribes, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. Miss Mitchell, you're asking us to believe that a respected mining entrepreneur would orchestrate attacks on his own people simply to justify military action against Indians. That seems far-fetched, even by frontier standards. Sarah opened her portfolio and began laying out the evidence that had convinced Captain Henderson and territorial authorities of Morrison's guilt. Purchase orders, meeting transcripts, testimony from Morrison's surviving conspirators, and the detailed timeline of events that showed how each incident had been carefully planned to escalate tensions. Representative Bradford, I'm not asking you to believe anything. I'm presenting evidence that has already resulted in Morrison's conviction in federal court and the dismantling of his organization. The question isn't whether Morrison's conspiracy existed. That's been proven beyond doubt. The question is what we learn from it and how we prevent similar conspiracies in the future. The evidence was indeed compelling, but Sarah knew that facts alone wouldn't change the fundamental attitudes that had made Morrison's conspiracy possible in the first place. Too many people in positions of power were invested in the narrative that Indians were inherently hostile and that conflict was inevitable. Representative James Wilson of Iowa, whose agricultural district had no direct experience with Indian relations, asked the question that Sarah had been expecting. Even accepting that Morrison orchestrated specific incidents, doesn't his conspiracy simply reveal underlying tensions that would have erupted into violence eventually? Perhaps his methods were wrong, but wasn't he correct that Indians and settlers cannot coexist peacefully? This was the crucial moment, Sarah realized. Everything that had happened, Little Fox's rescue, the alliance with Standing Bear, the cooperation between cavalry and warriors, would be meaningless if the Congressional Committee concluded that Morrison had been wrong in his methods, but right in his fundamental assumptions. Representative Wilson, I spent 3 days in my cabin surrounded by 50 Lakota warriors who had every reason to seek violent revenge for the attack on their chief's son. Those warriors were armed, angry, and fully capable of devastating every white settlement within 50 miles. But they chose to work with military authorities to seek justice through legal channels instead of through warfare. Sarah paused, letting the implications of that choice sink in before continuing. The violence that erupted wasn't between Indians and settlers. It was between honest people of both races working together against criminals who were trying to manipulate them into fighting each other. That tells us something important about where the real threats to peace come from. Chairman Hayes consulted his notes, clearly wrestling with the political implications of Sarah's testimony. Miss Mitchell, you're suggesting that federal policy should be based on the assumption that peaceful coexistence is possible between very different communities with conflicting interests over land and resources. I'm suggesting that federal policy should be based on evidence rather than assumptions, Sarah replied. And the evidence from Wyoming shows that when people are given alternatives to violence, many of them will choose those alternatives even under extremely stressful circumstances. Representative Bradford wasn't convinced. But what about the broader pattern of Indian conflicts throughout the West? Are you claiming that all of those were manufactured by conspirators like Morrison? Sarah had anticipated this question during her preparation, and she knew that her answer would determine whether her testimony was seen as relevant to broader policy or dismissed as an isolated incident. No, Representative Bradford, I'm not claiming that all frontier conflicts are artificial, but I am claiming that many conflicts are made worse by people who profit from violence and instability. Morrison's conspiracy succeeded as long as it did, because it fed into existing prejudices and fears on both sides. People were prepared to believe the worst about each other because they had been taught to expect conflict rather than cooperation. The questioning continued for most of the morning, with committee members probing different aspects of Sarah's account and the evidence she had compiled. But gradually, Sarah sensed a shift in the tone of the interrogation. The representatives were beginning to understand that what had happened in Wyoming represented something more significant than just another frontier incident. During the lunch recess, Chairman Hayes approached Sarah privately. "Miss Mitchell, your testimony raises troubling questions about how territorial authorities handle relations with Indian tribes. But it also suggests possibilities that frankly hadn't occurred to most of us." Sarah sensed an opportunity to move beyond simply recounting past events to proposing future solutions. "Chairman Hayes, what happened in Wyoming proves that cooperation between military authorities and tribal leaders can prevent conflicts that would otherwise seem inevitable." Captain Henderson and Chief Standing Bear found common ground because they were both more interested in preventing unnecessary deaths than in defending abstract principles. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "And you believe this model could be applied in other territorial situations?" "I believe it's already being applied in other territorial situations, but on an informal basis that depends on the personal judgment of individual officers and tribal leaders. What we need is an official policy that encourages this kind of cooperation instead of treating it as an exception to normal procedures." When the committee reconvened after lunch, Chairman Hayes announced that they would be hearing additional testimony from Captain Henderson, who had traveled from Wyoming specifically to support Sarah's account. Henderson's military credentials and his detailed knowledge of frontier conditions added authoritative weight to Sarah's civilian perspective. "Captain Henderson," Representative Wilson began, "Miss Mitchell claims that cooperation with Indian leaders prevented what could have been a devastating regional conflict. But didn't your cooperation with Chief Standing Bear violate military protocols for dealing with potentially hostile tribes?" Henderson had clearly anticipated this question. "Representative Wilson, my orders were to maintain peace and stability in my sector. When I became aware that Morrison's conspiracy was designed to create instability that would require massive military intervention, preventing that conspiracy became a legitimate military objective." The captain's testimony was particularly effective because he could speak to the practical military benefits of cooperation with tribal authorities. "Working with Chief Standing Bear gave me intelligence about Morrison's activities that I couldn't have obtained through normal military channels. It also prevented the kind of misunderstanding that often escalates minor incidents into major conflicts." Representative Bradford pressed Henderson on the broader implications of his approach. "Captain, are you suggesting that military commanders should routinely coordinate with Indian leaders when dealing with territorial conflicts?" Henderson's answer was carefully measured. "I'm suggesting that military commanders should use all available resources to accomplish their missions effectively. In many frontier situations, tribal leaders have information and capabilities that can be crucial to maintaining peace. Ignoring those resources for reasons of policy or prejudice is tactically foolish." The afternoon session focused on the specific mechanisms that had made cooperation possible between such different communities. Sarah and Henderson described the step-by-step process of building trust, sharing information, and coordinating actions between groups that had every historical reason to mistrust each other. The key, Sarah explained, was focusing on shared interests rather than historical grievances. Both the military and the tribal authorities wanted to prevent unnecessary violence and protect innocent people. Once we established that common ground, other differences became manageable. Henderson added the military perspective. Standard operating procedures assume that Indian tribes are either allies or enemies, with no middle ground. But Chief Standing Bear showed me that there's a much more complex spectrum of possible relationships. Temporary cooperation for specific objectives can exist even when broader disagreements remain unresolved. As the day's testimony concluded, Sarah could see that the committee members were genuinely grappling with the implications of what they had heard. Representative Wilson, who had been most skeptical earlier, asked the final question that would shape the committee's recommendations. Miss Mitchell, Captain Henderson, if Congress were to modify federal policy to encourage the kind of cooperation you've described, what specific changes would you recommend? Sarah and Henderson exchanged glances, recognizing that this was their opportunity to transform a personal experience into systemic change. They had discussed this possibility during Henderson's journey to Washington, but now they had to articulate concrete policy proposals that could actually be implemented. First, Sarah began, territorial and military authorities should be required to consult with tribal leaders before making decisions that affect Indian communities. Not token consultation, but genuine collaboration in developing solutions to shared problems. Henderson continued the thought. Second, military officers should receive training in diplomacy and negotiation, not just tactics and strategy. Many conflicts escalate because military personnel don't have the skills or authority to pursue alternatives to force. Third, Sarah added, there should be formal mechanisms for investigating claims of manufactured conflicts like Morrison's conspiracy. Too often, people like Morrison operate successfully because no one in authority is looking for evidence of deliberate provocation. Henderson concluded with the recommendation that would prove most controversial. Finally, there should be official recognition that preventing war is more important than winning war. Officers who successfully resolve conflicts through negotiation should be rewarded at least as much as those who achieve military victories. The committee's final report, issued 6 weeks later, incorporated many of these recommendations into what became known as the Mitchell-Henderson Protocols for Territorial Indian Relations. The protocols established formal procedures for military-tribal cooperation, created training programs for frontier diplomacy, and established investigation procedures for claims of manufactured conflicts. More importantly, the protocols represented a fundamental shift in federal thinking about frontier relations. Instead of assuming that conflict was inevitable and focusing on military solutions, the new policy emphasized prevention through cooperation and early intervention in potentially explosive situations. Sarah returned to Wyoming to find that her cabin had become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in studying the new approaches to frontier diplomacy. Territorial officials, military officers, tribal leaders, and academics made their way to her isolated clearing to learn about the practical details of how cooperation had been achieved under seemingly impossible circumstances. Little Fox, now fully recovered and serving as an informal interpreter and cultural guide, often participated in these discussions. His perspective as someone who had been victimized by the old approach to frontier relations but had also benefited from the new cooperative model provided compelling evidence for the effectiveness of the Mitchell-Henderson protocols. Captain Henderson was promoted to major and assigned to implement the new protocols throughout the mountain territories. His success in Wyoming had demonstrated that military officers could be effective diplomats when given proper training and support. and his new position allowed him to train other officers in the techniques he had developed. Chief Standing Bear became the first Native American to be officially recognized as a federal consultant on territorial Indian policy. His insights into tribal perspectives on cooperation and conflict prevention proved invaluable in developing policies that actually worked in practice rather than just looking good on paper. The broader impact of the Morrison conspiracy's exposure extended far beyond the immediate participants. Other territorial officials began investigating suspicious patterns of conflict in their own regions, and several additional conspiracies were uncovered and disrupted before they could achieve their objectives. The mining industry, embarrassed by Morrison's criminal behavior, established new ethical guidelines and oversight procedures to prevent similar abuse of economic power. While some mining operations continued to create tensions with local communities, the industry as a whole began to recognize that long-term profitability depended on maintaining peaceful relations with all territorial residents. Perhaps most significantly, the success of the Mitchell-Henderson protocols began to change public attitudes about the possibility of peaceful coexistence between different communities on the frontier. Newspapers throughout the country carried accounts of the Wyoming cooperation, and similar collaborative approaches began appearing in other territorial conflicts. Sarah's testimony to Congress had lasted only one day, but its effects rippled through American frontier policy for decades. The little cabin where 50 warriors had once surrounded a rescued child became a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, truth over manipulation, and justice over revenge. And in the quiet moments between the visits from officials and academics, Sarah would sit on her porch and remember the frightened child she had found in a dark mine shaft, knowing that his rescue had somehow transformed not just his life, but the entire framework for how Americans thought about building communities. In difficult places, 2 years after the Morrison conspiracy's exposure, Sarah Mitchell received an unexpected visitor at her cabin. A well-dressed woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Elizabeth Crenshaw, a journalist from Harper's Weekly. Crenshaw had traveled from New York specifically to investigate reports of a radical social experiment taking place in the Wyoming Territory, where whites and Indians were said to be living and working together in ways that defied conventional wisdom about frontier relations. "Miss Mitchell," Crenshaw began, settling into the chair that Sarah offered on her front porch, "I've come to Wyoming because my editors are skeptical about reports they've been receiving regarding what they call the Wyoming model of territorial cooperation. They want me to determine whether these reports represent genuine innovation or simply wishful thinking by frontier romantics." Sarah poured coffee for both of them, studying her visitor with the careful attention that frontier life had taught her to pay to strangers. Elizabeth Crenshaw had the confident bearing of an educated Eastern woman, but her practical traveling clothes and the way she handled her horse suggested someone who had spent considerable time in challenging environments. "What exactly have your editors heard about Wyoming?" Sarah asked. Crenshaw consulted a leather notebook filled with precise handwriting. "They've heard that military officers are routinely consulting with Indian chiefs before making tactical decisions. They've heard that white settlers and Indian families are participating in joint economic ventures. Most surprisingly, they've heard that territorial courts are successfully arbitrating disputes between white and Indian parties using procedures that both sides consider fair." Sarah nodded, recognizing accurate descriptions of developments that had grown out of the Mitchell-Henderson protocols. "Your editors are hearing correct information, but I suspect they're having trouble believing it because it contradicts everything they thought they knew about frontier relations." "Precisely," Crenshaw agreed. My assignment is to spend several weeks in Wyoming documenting these developments and determining whether they represent a sustainable model for territorial governance or simply a temporary anomaly that will collapse. When faced with serious challenges, over the following days, Sarah served as Crenshaw's guide to the complex network of cooperative relationships that had evolved throughout the region. They visited joint trading posts where white merchants and Indian craftsmen worked together to serve customers from both communities. They observed military patrols that included both cavalry soldiers and tribal scouts working as equal partners rather than as commanders and subordinates. Most significantly, they attended a territorial court session where Judge Harold Morrison, relation to the disgraced Colonel Morrison, was presiding over a land dispute between a white homesteader and a Shoshone family. The case involved overlapping claims to a valuable piece of grazing land near a reliable water source, exactly the kind of dispute that had traditionally escalated into violence. "This is remarkable," Crenshaw whispered to Sarah as they watched. "The proceedings. Both parties have legal representation, both are presenting evidence according to the same standards, and the judge is treating their claims with equal seriousness." Sarah nodded, remembering the skepticism that had greeted the first attempts to establish such procedures. It took nearly a year to develop court procedures that both communities would accept as legitimate. The key was recognizing that fair treatment doesn't necessarily mean identical treatment. Different communities may need different approaches to achieve the same standard of justice. The homesteader, a German immigrant named Klaus Weber, was arguing that he had properly filed his claim according to territorial law and had invested considerable labor in improving the land. The Shoshone family, represented by a spokesman named Joseph Crow Feather, claimed traditional use rights based on generations of seasonal occupation and argued that Weber's improvements had damaged sacred sites. Judge Morrison listened carefully to both presentations, asking detailed questions that demonstrated his familiarity with both territorial law and tribal customs. Most impressive to Crenshaw was the fact that both parties seemed to trust the judicial process, despite their fundamental disagreement about the facts of the case. How was this level of mutual trust established? Crenshaw asked Sarah during a recess in the proceedings. Through consistent application of the principle that both communities deserve equal protection under territorial law, Sarah replied. Judge Morrison spent months meeting with tribal leaders and white settlers to understand their different approaches to property rights and dispute resolution. Then he developed hybrid procedures that incorporated the best elements of both systems. When court resumed, Judge Morrison announced his decision. Weber would retain legal title to the portion of land that he had actively improved, but he would compensate the Shoshone family for the loss of traditional use rights. Additionally, Weber would be required to restore the damaged sacred sites and to allow continued seasonal access for traditional ceremonies. Both parties accepted the decision without apparent resentment, and Crenshaw watched in fascination as Weber and Crow Feather shook hands outside the courthouse and began discussing practical details of the compensation arrangement. "This is exactly what my editors will find hardest to believe," Crenshaw told Sarah as they walked back to their hotel. "Disputes that would have resulted in violence in other territories are being resolved through legal procedures that both sides respect." Sarah understood the journalist's amazement, but she also recognized the careful groundwork that had made such outcomes possible. The legal procedures work because they're based on the same principles that made military cooperation successful, focusing on shared interests rather than historical grievances. Over the following week, Crenshaw documented numerous examples of what she began calling practical integration throughout the Wyoming Territory. At the joint trading posts, she found white customers learning traditional crafts from Indian artisans. while Indian families adopted improved agricultural techniques from white farmers. Military patrols that included both cavalry and tribal scouts were proving more effective at maintaining regional security than traditional all-white units. Perhaps most surprising to someone from the East was the emergence of what local people called cultural bridges, individuals who served as interpreters and mediators between different communities. Little Fox had become one of the most prominent of these cultural bridges, using his fluency in both English and Lakota to facilitate communication in everything from business negotiations to legal proceedings. Crenshaw interviewed Little Fox extensively, recognizing that his perspective as someone who had been victimized under the old system but had thrived under the new cooperative model provided crucial evidence about the practical benefits of the Wyoming experiment. Before the changes, Little Fox told her through careful English that reflected his formal education, "My people and white people saw each other as enemies or strangers. Now we see each other as neighbors who must learn to live together. This is better for everyone, but it requires more work than simple hatred." The young man's mature perspective impressed Crenshaw, but she was particularly struck by his analysis of the challenges that remained in building sustainable cooperation. "The old way was simpler," Little Fox explained. "When groups are enemies, everyone knows what to expect. When groups are trying to be partners, everyone must learn new ways of thinking and acting. Some people on both sides prefer the simplicity of conflict to the complexity of cooperation." This insight proved crucial to Crenshaw's understanding of the Wyoming model's limitations. During her interviews with various community leaders, she discovered that the cooperative relationships worked well when they involved practical problem-solving, but became strained when they touched on deeper cultural or religious differences. Reverend Samuel Carter, a Methodist minister who had arrived in Wyoming 6 months earlier, expressed the concerns that some white settlers had about the territorial experiment. "I support peaceful relations with the Indian population," Carter told Crenshaw, "but I worry that some of our people are compromising essential Christian values in their eagerness to accommodate heathen practices." Similar concerns existed within tribal communities. Windwalker, an elderly Lakota spiritual leader, shared his worries about younger tribal members who were adopting white customs and losing connection to traditional ways. "Cooperation is good," Windwalker said through an interpreter, "but not if it means our grandchildren forget who they are and where they come from." These tensions came to a head during Crenshaw's 3rd week in Wyoming, when a controversy erupted over plans for a joint school that would serve both white and Indian children. Progressive community leaders saw the school as a natural extension of the cooperation that had proven successful in economic and legal matters. But conservative voices in both communities opposed the idea, fearing that integrated education would weaken their distinct cultural identities. The debate over the joint school provided Crenshaw with her most dramatic example of the challenges inherent in the Wyoming model. She attended heated community meetings where neighbors who had worked together successfully on practical problems found themselves in bitter disagreement over deeper questions of cultural preservation and social integration. Sarah served as a mediator in many of these discussions, using her unique position as someone trusted by both communities to help navigate the complex emotions and competing values at stake. Crenshaw was impressed by Sarah's ability to acknowledge the legitimacy of different concerns while steering conversations toward potential compromises. "The question isn't whether our communities should preserve their distinct identities," Sarah argued at one particularly tense meeting. "The question is whether we can preserve those identities while also learning from each other and working together on shared challenges." The school controversy ultimately revealed both the strengths and limitations of the Wyoming experiment After months of discussion, the communities reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely but provided something that everyone could accept. The joint school would operate for practical subjects like mathematics, science, and English language instruction, while each community would maintain separate institutions for cultural education and religious instruction. Crenshaw recognized this compromise as typical of the Wyoming model, practical solutions that focused on shared needs while respecting fundamental differences. It wasn't the ideal outcome that either progressive or conservative voices had hoped for, but it was a workable solution that allowed cooperation to continue despite disagreement on deeper issues. As her investigation neared its end, Crenshaw found herself wrestling with how to present her findings to skeptical Eastern readers. The Wyoming experiment was clearly successful by many measures. Violence between communities had virtually ceased, economic cooperation was flourishing, and legal disputes were being resolved peacefully. But the model also faced ongoing challenges and required constant attention to maintain the delicate balance between cooperation and cultural preservation. Her final interview was with Major Henderson, who had been promoted again and was now responsible for implementing the Mitchell-Henderson protocols throughout the mountain territories. Henderson provided Crenshaw with the military perspective on the experiment's broader implications. The Wyoming model proves that frontier communities don't have to choose between security and justice, Henderson explained. We can have both, but only if we're willing to invest the time and effort required to build genuine cooperation rather than simply imposing order through force. Henderson also addressed the scalability question that concerned federal policymakers. The principles that work in Wyoming can be applied elsewhere, but the specific procedures need to be adapted to local conditions and cultures. What we've developed here is a framework for cooperation, not a rigid set of rules that can be imposed everywhere. Crenshaw's final article for Harper's Weekly, published in 3 installments over consecutive months, provided Eastern readers with their most detailed look at the practical realities of frontier cooperation. Her conclusion was cautiously optimistic. The Wyoming model represented a genuine innovation in territorial governance that offered significant advantages over traditional approaches, but it required sustained commitment from all participants and couldn't solve every problem that arose from cultural differences. The Wyoming experiment demonstrates that Americans of different backgrounds can learn to live together peacefully and productively, Crenshaw wrote in her final paragraph. But it also demonstrates that such cooperation requires constant effort, mutual respect, and willingness to compromise on all sides. Whether this model can be sustained over the long term or expanded to other regions remains to be seen. What cannot be disputed is that it offers hope for a different kind of American frontier, one built on cooperation rather than conquest. The publication of Crenshaw's articles created a national debate about frontier policy and the possibilities for different approaches to territorial development. Some readers were inspired by the Wyoming example and advocated for similar experiments in other regions. Others remained skeptical about the long-term viability of such cooperation and argued that it represented an unrealistic departure from natural patterns of competition and conflict. But in Wyoming itself, the daily work of building cooperative communities continued. The joint school opened its doors that fall, with Little Fox serving as one of its first teachers. The territorial court system continued to evolve, incorporating new procedures as different types of cases arose. Military patrols maintained regional security through partnerships that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. And in her cabin beside the clear mountain stream, Sarah Mitchell continued to welcome visitors who came to study the Wyoming model. Each visitor brought new perspectives and challenges, but they all left with the same fundamental understanding. that the choice between cooperation and conflict wasn't determined by circumstances, but by the courage and wisdom of individuals willing to seek better alternatives to traditional patterns of violence and mistrust. 10 years after that storm-lashed night, when Sarah Mitchell first heard a child's cries echoing from the depths of an abandoned mine, she stood at the podium of the newly constructed Wyoming Territorial Capitol building, preparing to deliver the keynote address at the first Western Conference on Territorial Cooperation. The audience included territorial governors, military commanders, tribal leaders, and federal officials from across the American West, all gathered to study what had become known internationally as the Wyoming Protocol. The transformation of her simple cabin clearing into the site of national policy discussions would have seemed impossible during those desperate hours when 50 Lakota warriors surrounded her home. Now, delegates from as far away as California and Montana had traveled to Wyoming to learn how sustained cooperation between diverse communities could become the foundation for territorial governance. Sarah looked out at the assembled crowd, recognizing faces that represented the full spectrum of Western experience. Governor Patricia Reynolds of Colorado sat beside Chief Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota. General William Sherman's aide shared notes with Captain Maria Gonzalez, one of the first Latina officers in the Territorial Cavalry. Dr. Chen Wei, representing Chinese communities in California mining districts, was engaged in animated discussion with Rabbi Samuel Goldstein from the Montana Territory's growing Jewish settlements. 10 years ago, Sarah began, I discovered that a single act of compassion toward one injured child could set in motion changes that none of us could have imagined. Today, Wyoming stands as proof that Americans of all backgrounds can build communities based on cooperation rather than conquest, on justice rather than domination. But Sarah's speech wasn't a simple celebration of success. The decade since Morrison's conspiracy had taught her that sustainable cooperation required constant vigilance and continuous adaptation to new challenges. The Wyoming model hasn't eliminated conflict, she continued honestly. What it has done is provide us with tools for resolving conflicts peacefully and fairly. We've learned that cooperation isn't a destination. It's a daily choice that every generation must make. In the audience, Little Fox, now known by his chosen English name, Thomas Standing Bear, translated Sarah's words for elderly tribal members who preferred their native languages. At 21, Thomas had become the Wyoming Territory's first Native American attorney, having completed his legal education through a combination of traditional mentorship and formal study. His presence in the territorial capital as both translator and legal advisor symbolized the integration that had become possible under the Wyoming model. The conference's 3 days of presentations revealed how broadly the Wyoming innovations had spread throughout the West. Colonel Henderson, now commanding the Department of the Platte, described military cooperation programs that had reduced frontier violence by 70% across 5 territories. Judge Morrison presented legal reforms that had created the first integrated court systems in American history. Dr. Rebecca Chen, Sarah's former medical student who had established the territory's first integrated hospital, outlined healthcare cooperation that had dramatically reduced mortality rates in both white and Native communities. But the most compelling testimony came from ordinary citizens whose lives had been transformed by the decade of cooperation. Maria Santos, a Mexican-American rancher, described how technical cooperation with Navajo herders had revolutionized livestock management throughout the Southwest. Johann Müller, a German immigrant farmer, explained how agricultural techniques learned from Cherokee communities had tripled crop yields in previously marginal lands. These personal stories illustrated what Sarah considered the greatest achievement of the Wyoming experiment, the demonstration that diversity could be a source of strength rather than division when communities chose cooperation over competition. However, the conference also addressed the significant challenges that remained. Reverend Carter, now leading a coalition of conservative religious leaders, presented concerns about cultural assimilation and the preservation of distinct community identities. His presentation sparked intense debate about the balance between integration and cultural preservation. Cooperation has brought many benefits, Carter acknowledged, but we must ensure that it doesn't require communities to abandon their essential values and traditions. The goal should be peaceful coexistence, not cultural homogenization. Windwalker, now in his 70s but still sharp and articulate, provided the tribal perspective on these concerns. Speaking through Thomas Standing Bear's translation, the elderly spiritual leader emphasized that cooperation could only succeed if it respected the sovereignty and dignity of all participating communities. "The white man's ways are not always better," Windwalker said, "and the Indian ways are not always better. Wisdom comes from choosing the best from all traditions while preserving what is sacred in each." The conference's final session focused on the question that had brought federal officials to Wyoming, whether the cooperation model could be scaled up to address national challenges. The United States was experiencing unprecedented immigration from Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, creating exactly the kind of cultural diversity that had once led to conflict on the frontier. Sarah's closing address tackled this question directly. Wyoming has shown that cooperation is possible between communities with very different backgrounds and interests, but scaling up this model requires more than copying our specific procedures. It requires embracing the principles that made cooperation possible in the first place. Those principles, Sarah explained, included genuine respect for cultural differences, commitment to fair treatment under law, economic partnerships that benefited all participants, and most importantly, the recognition that long-term security depended on justice rather than domination. "The choice we face as a nation," Sarah concluded, "is the same choice we faced in Wyoming 10 years ago. We can continue patterns of competition and conflict that leave everyone poorer and less secure, or we can invest the effort required to build cooperative communities that make everyone stronger." The conference's final resolution, signed by representatives from 12 territories and 4 states, committed participating governments to implementing modified versions of the Wyoming Protocol within 5 years. More significantly, the resolution established ongoing cooperation between military, civilian, and tribal authorities in addressing future challenges. As delegates prepared to return to their home territories, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a child's cry in an abandoned mine shaft. The rescue of Little Fox, now Thomas Standing Bear, had seemed like a simple act of human compassion. But that single decision to help an injured child had ultimately challenged fundamental assumptions about how different communities could relate to each other. The transformation hadn't been easy or complete. Prejudice and mistrust still existed in Wyoming, just as they existed throughout the country. Economic competition still created tensions between different groups. Cultural differences still led to misunderstandings and conflicts. But Wyoming had proven that these challenges weren't insurmountable. Through patient work, consistent principles, and willingness to adapt to changing circumstances, communities could learn to live together peacefully and productively. Thomas Standing Bear approached Sarah as the conference concluded, carrying a leather-bound volume that contained transcripts of all the proceedings. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "I want to present this record to you as a token of gratitude from all the communities that have benefited from the changes you helped begin." Sarah accepted the volume with deep emotion, recognizing that it represented not just the conference proceedings, but the culmination of a decade of cooperative effort by thousands of people. "Thomas," she replied, "this belongs to all of us. What we've accomplished in Wyoming wasn't the work of any single person. It was the result of countless individuals choosing cooperation over conflict, justice over revenge, and hope over fear." As the sun set over the Wind River Range, Sarah made her way back to her cabin, which had been preserved as a historical site and symbol of the Wyoming experiment. The clearing where 50 warriors had once surrounded her home was now marked with a monument describing the events that had changed territorial history. But for Sarah, the real monument wasn't made of stone and bronze. It was the thriving, diverse communities throughout Wyoming, where children of all backgrounds attended integrated schools, where families of different cultures participated in joint economic ventures, and where conflicts were resolved through legal procedures that all communities respected. The frightened child she had found dying in that dark mine shaft had grown into a respected leader who bridged cultures and served justice. The warriors who had surrounded her cabin seeking vengeance had become partners in building a more peaceful society. The conspiracy that had threatened to destroy both communities had ultimately catalyzed innovations that benefited everyone. Sitting on her porch as stars appeared over the mountains, Sarah thought about the letter she had received that morning from Elizabeth Crenshaw, now editor of a national magazine dedicated to reporting on social innovations. Crenshaw's letter described similar cooperation experiments beginning in urban areas throughout the East, inspired by the Wyoming model, but adapted to the different challenges of industrial society. The principles that had worked in Wyoming, respect for differences, commitment to fairness, focus on shared interests, were proving relevant far beyond the frontier. The child's cry that had echoed from an abandoned mine a decade earlier had somehow grown into a voice for change that was being heard across the entire continent. As Sarah prepared for sleep in the cabin where this remarkable journey had begun, she felt profound gratitude for the choices that had been made and the courage that had been shown by so many people. The Wyoming experiment had succeeded not because it had eliminated human conflicts and prejudices, but because it had provided better ways to address them. The story that had begun with individual compassion for one injured child had become a demonstration of what was possible when entire communities chose to act with compassion toward each other. And that, Sarah knew, was a legacy worth any risk she had taken to help a dying child in a dark and lonely mine shaft. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.